I hope that everyone's Tuesday is going well. I wanted to check in and talk about a couple things. First, I wanted to go over Epideictic Rhetoric and the Epideictic speech, which is the third speech. I want to thank everyone for turning in the persuasive speech. I should have grades back to you guys shortly. So we've done informative, persuasive. The third speech is what's called epideictic. So that comes from Aristotle, who's obviously a very famous Greek philosopher. He was the student of Plato, right? In the Socrates, Plato, Aristotle trio of the kind of most famous of the three Athenian Greek philosophers. And he wrote a book that is one of the defining books on public speaking, rhetoric, the construction of meaning through discourse, which is literally just called rhetoric. And in that, he split rhetoric up into three categories. So the first one is what is called deliberative rhetoric, and this juxtaposes potential future outcomes to communicate support or opposition for a given action or policy. So it's essentially, if you think of the Greek polis or the city center, it's where people would debate policy. So will this or this law or policy, will it help people or will it hurt people? Will it be harmful or beneficial in the future? So that was one. Two is what's called forensic rhetoric. So we have deliberative and forensic. Forensic is it's essentially legal rhetoric, right? Like if you think of like forensics as like the police unit that sees whether something like a crime scene, right? So forensic rhetoric is always kind of in the past, and it's did actions in the past break the law or not. So it's essentially a legal discourse. And then the third one is what's called epideictic. So epideictic is rhetoric regarding to praise or blame of a virtue or vice within like a communal setting. So essentially examples of epideictic rhetoric would be things like a wedding toast or a funeral speech, right? It's essentially where you are saying this person or this institution or this group of people are moral exemplars of society. They are praiseworthy, or on the other hand, they are blameworthy, right? Like they are not virtuous. They exhibit vice. So for epideictic rhetoric for it to really make sense, we have to think about it in terms of the moral framework that Aristotle was a part of. So I don't know if any of you guys have heard of these competing moral frameworks from high school or from like any intro to ethics class, any philosophy class. We'll probably talk about this at some point. So there's essentially three different moral framework categories to consider when making moral choices. So the first is what's called deontology. It's associated with the philosopher Immanuel Kant, and it is essentially a rules-based moral framework. So it's a normative theory, normative meaning like what should be, right? Like what should be the norms regarding which choices are morally required, forbidden, or permitted. So essentially it's asking the question like, is this ethical? Should we do it? So it's not asking what the outcomes will be, but it is saying, is the decision ethical? So a way to think about this is to think of it as a rule. So say we have like the moral law, lying is wrong. That's something most people believe. But there are sometimes when the consequences of lying can be ethical. So the famous example is like the axe murderer comes to your house and he says, "Where's your wife?" And if you're like, "Oh, she's over there," it's like the outcome is going to be bad, right? But for Kant or someone in the deontological school of ethics, you should be honest because lying is wrong regardless of the consequences. And Kant kind of rationalized this by saying that you never know what's going to happen in the world, like outcomes-wise, but you do know a sense of moral right and wrong, like input-wise. See? So he would say you should still say where your wife is, even though it's likely that something could come bad of it. So that's deontology. That contrasts with what is called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is basically the insight that the morally appropriate behavior is what produces the greatest utility, right? Or the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This comes from such philosophers as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. There are a couple problems with this, that greatest good for the greatest number can sometimes violate basic sort of moral wrongs that we feel. So, for example, if a doctor could kill a perfectly healthy person in order to harvest their organs in order to save 10 people, this would, from a utility standpoint, be the greatest good for the greatest number, but it's something that we generally would look at as unethical behavior. Similarly, this sort of utilitarian versus deontological debate arose in the 2000s with regards to torture. So people said that torturing terrorism suspects at Guantanamo Bay by the U.S. government is worth it if the outcome will be good, right? If we can get information that will prevent harm in the long run, right? Versus people who had the more deontological outlook, which is that torture is wrong and should never be done and under any circumstances because it's morally harmful. But there is a third school of ethics that is like a less well known or less well talked about in the modern world, which is called virtue ethics. And this actually comes from Aristotle in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics. Aristotle didn't write anything down, but so the notes that we have of his writing come from his students. Nicomachus was one of his students who took notes on his discussion of ethics, and so it's called the Nicomachean Ethics. That's the book name. So for Aristotle, the question isn't are the outcomes good, or is this does this violate our ethical rules? But will doing this action make you a more virtuous or less virtuous person? So is it a virtue to do this act, right? So it's not about good consequences, and it's not about rules or duties, but instead it's like a little more fundamental than this. It's grounded in sort of your character, right? So does a person with a good character act this way? Or does a person with a bad character act this way? And that's how you know whether something is moral or not moral. Now, of course, this sort of brings up the obvious question, what is virtue? So for Aristotle, virtue is the mean between two extremes. So that might sound confusing, but for him it's essentially if you look at a set of behavior, there is behavior in the extreme, which he called a vice, and then there is a deficiency of a certain behavior, and then acting in the middle is what he called virtue. So an example of that could be something like courage, right? Courage is a virtue. If you have too much courage, if you have an excess of courage, maybe someone is rash. But if you have a deficiency in courage, someone is a coward. So another example could be modesty. If someone has an excess of modesty, they can be shy. But if someone has a deficiency of modesty, they can be shameless, right? Or ambition. So ambition is the mean in between the excess, right, which is sort of like a careerist, climber mindset, backstabber, or the deficiency of ambition, which could be laziness or a lack of spirit or trying hard, right? So that's for Aristotle what virtue and vice was. Virtue is the mean, the average, in between two extremes, excess and deficiency. But still, it kind of raises the question of what does it mean to be a virtuous person or to have a virtuous character? So Aristotle said that to be virtuous, you want to do as the virtuous do, which is another kind of confusing philosophical way of thinking. But for him, the way that you knew who was virtuous was to act like other virtuous people. So this is where we get to epideictic rhetoric. So a way that you can learn good examples or like have role models is to hear speeches about people who you hold in virtue, who you look up to. So in the Greek polis, they would have people who would give speeches, epideictic speeches, and be like, you should be like this person. This person exhibits good moral character. They're a role model. Other people should be like them, right? And this is how virtue and vice were taught, was through these epideictic speeches, praising certain people and blaming other people for their character as role models for a communal sense of morality. So that's another thing that's really big for virtue ethics, is that character is a sort of communally determined value. So essentially what I want you guys to do is pick a person or an institution and give me a 7-minute speech on whether that person is virtuous, should be praised, or has acts with vice and should be blamed, right? So essentially talk about the morality as a communal example of a person or institution and say whether they're praiseworthy or blameworthy. Yeah? And that's epideictic rhetoric. Yeah. So, if anyone has any questions on that, let me know. Thanks.